Louis XIII was considered the most handsome king in European history. He had a perfect figure and an almost magical charm. He could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without getting tired. When he walked by, foreign ambassadors were simply speechless. Louis spoke 5 languages fluently and remembered the names of more than 3,000 courtiers. But this is not mentioned in school textbooks. The same king who built the most luxurious palace in the world ended his life as a rotting, toothless corpse, weighing nearly 200 kilograms and suffering from gangrene. His courtiers were forced to wear scented masks to even come near him. The smell was so strong that foreign diplomats couldn't stand it. They started vomiting right at the audience. There are ancient medical records confirming every gruesome detail of the transformation of the golden god of Europe into a living corpse. French historians tried to hide these documents for almost half a millennium. So, imagine, May 6th, 1661, Versailles. Young Louis is only 23. He slowly descends the marble staircase in a ceremonial robe weighing 15 kilograms, embroidered with real gold. A crowd of 5,000 people freezes. The king, about 1.75 meters tall with a muscular physique and shiny black hair, passes by Venetian mirrors reflecting his flawless figure. Sunlight streaming through the crystal windows illuminates him, as if emphasizing that a true god stands before them. His voice was so clear and powerful that it could be heard even from a distance of 45 meters. His bright blue eyes were compared by courtiers to falling stars. So piercing was his gaze. His confident gait made even the heavy floors of Versailles vibrate beneath his feet. And Louis's natural masculine scent attracted everyone, women and men alike. But behind his appearance was more than just a handsome man with a crown. Louis spoke French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German fluently. By the age of 20, he had surpassed his Italian fencing instructors, who were considered the best in all of Europe. Louis could dance ballet for 6 hours without stopping, and then compose poems that moved the British ambassador Nathaniel Cold to tears. His physical abilities were astonishing. According to archives, he ate 4 hearty meals and 3 snacks a day without losing his athletic form. He would hunt wild boar for 8 hours in the forests near Versailles and then dance until 3 in the morning without tiring. He had an astonishing memory. He knew more than 3,000 of his courtiers by sight and by name and remembered details about their families. And his appetite extended beyond food. Servants secretly recorded that he was intimate with at least 12 different women every month. One Venetian ambassador described his charm as almost supernatural. When Louis entered a room, all conversation ceased. Hearts began to beat faster, and even his sworn political enemies were struck speechless. It was the heyday of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV was its embodiment. Every morning, more than 100 courtiers literally fought for the honor of handing him a silk shirt during the morning ritual. They argued over who would hold the mirror, who would pour water for washing, and who would tie his shoelaces. In the evening, grown men competed for the right to blow out his candle before bedtime. The entire Palace of Versailles was designed as a stage for this royal spectacle. Every day, up to 10,000 courtiers gathered here, and all their actions were planned in advance, just like in a theater. When Louis walked through the Hall of Mirrors, the endless reflections created the illusion that his very presence was spreading everywhere. The marble under his feet was brought from Italy at great expense, just so that the king's footsteps would sound regal. But even in those glorious years, there were already signs of trouble. Secret notes from the court physician, deciphered only in 1987, point to early symptoms that were preferred to be kept quiet at the time. By the age of 20, Louis had to have 2 or 3 enemas a day just to go to the bathroom. He ate 6 to 8 times a day. This was no longer just gluttony, but a real addiction. His breath constantly smelled bad, and to hide it, he ate mint pastilles. His skin was oily and covered with acne, which he hid under a thick layer of white powder and rouge. Court documents confirm that he had serious digestive problems that required regular medical attention. All this was carefully hidden from the eyes of the courtiers, and even more so from the common people. In the kingdom, the monarch's weaknesses were turned into sacred rituals. But the most frightening detail was Louis's almost complete aversion to water. Every day he washed only his hands and face. The rest of his body was cleaned only a few times in his entire life. At that time, it was believed that water could weaken the body and open the way for evil spirits. The king himself believed that his natural odor was a manifestation of strength and divine greatness. This fatal misconception would soon lead to terrible consequences. Already in January 1686, something terrible began to develop in the most hidden, dark places of his body. What began as a simple reluctance to wash would soon turn into the beginning of decay. The prince, who danced until morning, would become a living symbol of human decline. On January 15th, Louis, who was then 47 years old, needed medical attention. He complained of slight discomfort when sitting. His attending physician, Guy Cresson-Fagan, a man with a grim trail of deaths behind him, diagnosed it as ordinary hemorrhoids. But this was no simple disorder. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades and literally consume the sun of France from within. Within a week, the pain became unbearable, as if a red-hot knife had been plunged into him. By January 22nd, the tumor had grown to the size of a walnut. By January 28th, Louis began to bleed constantly and had to sit on soft cushions during receptions. On February 5th, his servants complained for the first time about a strange smell coming from his clothes. By February 12th, an opening appeared near his rectum, from which pus and feces constantly flowed. Imagine the most disgusting infection you have ever seen, and multiply that horror by 100. That is what was happening to the most powerful man in Europe. The smell was unbearable. It seemed that rot itself accompanied Louis at every step. Dr. Fagan began treatment with methods that could hardly be called torture. He prescribed daily enemas, not just one or two, but dozens of cold water procedures every day. According to records, in 6 months, the king underwent more than 2,000 enemas. Fagan hoped to cleanse the body of corrupt humors, as they were called at the time. When the enemas had no effect, the doctor resorted to a much more brutal method: cauterization. He heated iron rods to a red-hot state and pressed them against the infected tissue. Louis had to be held down by several servants, and his screams echoed through the palace 3 floors below. However, the infection continued to spread. Then the bloodletting began. Every day, 500 milliliters of blood were drained from the king's body in the hope that this would purify his corrupt essence. All the treatment only worsened his condition. The process was supplemented with quack remedies. The mixtures became increasingly disgusting and useless. Bull semen mixed with wine, bull blood with crushed pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy. All of this was served as miraculous remedies. But Louis endured it all, just to keep up his image as a divine monarch. By November 1686, the situation was out of control. The smell was so awful that foreign ambassadors started making excuses to avoid meeting the king. A desperate measure was needed. This is when Charles-François Felix, the royal surgeon, entered the scene. He had to either save the king or die himself if the operation failed. He understood how difficult and dangerous his task was: to operate on the most powerful monarch in Europe without anesthesia, without modern experience, and with the knowledge that a mistake would cost him his head. So he began grueling training. Felix rehearsed on 75 prisoners and volunteers. Week after week, he performed 3 or 4 operations, honing every movement on people who had no choice. He even designed a special curved silver scalpel, which he called historial. This instrument was created solely to cut into the most sensitive parts of the king's body. On November 18, 1686, the day that changed everything arrived. At 6 in the morning, the surgeon and his team made their way through secret passages to Louis's chambers. There was no anesthesia, no painkillers. Only 4 courtiers were there to hold his arms and legs, and a wooden block for the king to bite down on when the unbearable pain began. Then began 3 hours of agony that would have broken anyone. Felix took his curved silver scalpel and began to cut open the infected fistula. Louis XIV was fully conscious and felt every movement of the blade. When the scalpel reached the depth of the abscess, such a stench escaped from the wound that 2 assistants ran out of the room, unable to bear it, and began to vomit. Blood spurted onto the silk sheets like a scarlet fountain. The king clenched the wooden block between his teeth twice, while Felix cut away the blackened, already dead tissue. At 9:15 in the morning, when the blade reached the sacrum, Louis cried out, "Mansour!" The cry echoed through all 3 floors of the palace. Felix's secret notes, found only in 2007, describe how more than 200 milliliters of greenish-blue pus oozed from the monarch's body, giving off the smell of dead flesh. The infected tissue fell away in layers, revealing bones already eaten away by rot. But that was only the beginning. Despite the horror of the operation, the wound would not heal. The infection had penetrated too deeply, and the damage was too severe. Louis required not 1, but 4 separate surgical procedures. The second operation took place on December 6th, the third on December 8th, and on December 10th, the most painful operation took place. It lasted 6 hours, during which the king was conscious. 6 people held him down while Felix literally cut open his body, as if participating in a medieval execution. In total, the operations took 15 hours, spread over 3 weeks. There was so much rotten tissue removed that it could have filled a large wine bowl. The pain was beyond human comprehension. But even after all this, the wound continued to fester. It gave off an unbearable odor and ate away at the king from the inside. When it was finally over and the damaged areas began to heal, the court physicians declared it a miracle. But in reality, they had not solved the problem. They had created a new one. Louis became a man whose body would never stop decomposing. His smell became the talk of the town, and his physical deterioration required ever new tricks to hide him from the eyes of European courts. By March 1687, the surgical scars had healed, but the consequences were horrific. A permanent anal fistula meant that pus and feces would continue to flow for the rest of his life. The king, once renowned for his natural attractive scent, now exuded a stench reminiscent of death. The changes were rapid and irreversible. Diplomats who had once vied for his attention now invented increasingly absurd excuses to avoid personal audiences. The Venetian ambassador wrote in his report that approaching the French monarch was like entering a tomb. The smell was not just unpleasant, it overwhelmed everything around him. Louis's response was a veritable revolution in the world of fragrances, the most expensive in history. He spent the equivalent of $2 million a year on perfumes collected from all over the world. Bulgarian rose, Arabian amber, Indian sandalwood. No fragrance was too expensive in his desperate attempt to hide the decay of his body. The entire palace of Versailles was transformed into a giant perfume machine. Fresh flowers were arranged in the halls every 2 hours. In every room where the king could enter, special vessels called causlets worked continuously, emitting fragrant smoke. Servants sprayed perfume on the furniture before Louis XIV touched it. Even the dishes were soaked in aromatic oils to somehow mask the stench coming from the monarch's mouth. But even the most expensive perfumes could not hide what was happening to his body. Numerous surgical injuries and a lack of normal physical activity led to catastrophic weight gain. In 1675, he weighed about 77 kilograms. By 1700, he weighed 120 kilograms. And by 1710, his weight had reached an incredible 140 kilograms. The king, once renowned for his grace, could no longer mount a horse without the help of 6 strong men. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times. He simply could not fit into the old one. Court artists were ordered to paint him only from certain angles to hide his size. But foreign guests were not fooled. One Russian ambassador sarcastically remarked that the French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a pregnant cow. Then came the dental disaster of 1693, which finally completed Louis's transformation into something barely human. The court physician, convinced that all diseases originated in the mouth, decided to pull out all the king's teeth at once. Without anesthesia, without proper instruments, only rough iron tongs and the inhuman screams of a 55-year-old man. The operation was a disaster. Along with the teeth, the doctor tore off part of the upper jaw and broke the lower jaw. A hole formed between his mouth and nose, and now food and wine flowed out of Louis's nostrils when he ate. His speech became slurred, and courtiers were forced to lean closer to hear the king's instructions, enduring the unbearable smell from his mouth. Saliva flowed constantly, dripping onto his clothes and the floor. Combined with the fistula and his enormous weight, Louis XIII was finally transformed from the most desirable monarch in Europe into a drooling, foul-smelling, suffering figure. A caricature of himself. And yet it is astonishing how desperately the court continued to maintain the illusion of his greatness. More than 200 new protocols were developed at Versailles to hide the king's true condition. Colored silk ribbons informed the courtiers of the monarch's condition. A red ribbon meant that it was best not to approach. He was in severe pain. White meant that it was possible to approach, but only wearing aromatic masks. Black meant that today was particularly difficult, especially with his intestines. The morning ceremony, which used to take 2 hours, now lasted only half an hour in order to get through the moment when the smell could be detected as quickly as possible. The evening ritual was also changed. Cloth pads were secretly placed under him to absorb the discharge from the fistula. The curtains were hung in a special way to hide the process of changing the dirty linen. The changes also affected the palace itself. The windows were opened strictly according to a plan, creating drafts that drove the smell away from the guests. 500 fresh flower arrangements were replaced every hour. All this was done to maintain the illusion that the sun of France was still shining. 50 special perfume devices worked around the clock throughout Versailles, creating clouds of fragrant smoke to mask the smell of decay. The courtiers were required to carry commodes with them, elegant balls filled with fragrant substances, in case of a sudden meeting with the king. Some guests began to breathe through handkerchiefs soaked in perfume, so as not to smell him. The most refined ladies of the court, after the obligatory audiences, excused themselves and ran out of the halls to avoid vomiting, but preferred to refer to feminine indisposition, so as not to admit aloud how repulsive their monarch had become. Diplomatic relations began to crack. It became increasingly difficult for ambassadors to endure the long receptions. The English ambassador officially requested that audiences be held only in the open air, citing health reasons. The Spanish representative began sending junior diplomats in his place. Some European countries began to doubt whether the king was capable of ruling the country, if he could not even cope with basic physiological functions. But despite all his ailments, Louis XIV still held absolute power. The worse his body became, the more fiercely he insisted on his divinity. Every rule, every ceremony, every gesture at court became a theatrical performance designed to hide the terrible truth. Their king was literally decaying, and all this was only a prelude to the horrors that occurred in his last month. The events of August 1715 eclipsed everything that had come before. What awaited the son of France in his final weeks would have shocked even the most hardened doctors. On August 11th at 4:30 in the morning, Louis awoke to a sharp cry of pain that shattered the silence of Versailles. His left leg was burning from the inside, as if it were being consumed by flames. Dr. Fagin, now almost blind and 72 years old, was summoned urgently. He diagnosed sciatica caused by immobility. In reality, it was the onset of senile dry gangrene, a condition that would destroy the king from within in 2 weeks. On August 15th, a black spot appeared on Louis's big toe. By the 18th, it had spread, and the skin became hot to the touch. On August 22nd, a new, almost indescribable smell appeared in the chambers. No longer just pus and feces, but the stench of rotting flesh. On the 25th, even Fagin could no longer deny what was happening. The spot covered almost his entire leg. The smell was so strong that servants fainted when they entered the bedroom. Modern doctors confirmed that Louis was suffering from dry gangrene, caused by poor blood circulation and infection, which could have been stopped by amputation. But who would dare to cut off the leg of someone considered God's chosen one? With each passing day, things got worse. On August 28th, when the king's stockings were being changed, his toe simply fell off. White bone protruded from the decaying flesh, and couriers fainted at the sight. On August 30th, gangrene reached his shin, and the stench filled 3 floors of the palace. Despite this, Louis continued to rule. This is what makes the last days of his reign truly unique. His body was literally falling apart, but he still ruled France. He continued to sign decrees with a trembling hand, even when his flesh was already decomposing. He received foreign ambassadors, reeking of death. He gave military orders in an increasingly hoarse voice. Gangrene had reached his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in horror, "The French king is dying before our eyes." The Austrian representative called it the most horrible sight he had ever seen, and yet the ceremonies continued. Absolute monarchy continued to live, even as its embodiment turned into a living corpse. Courtiers visited the king only in scented masks. The sheets had to be changed every 2 hours due to constant discharge. Many members of the team of 20 servants who cared for the monarch asked to be transferred. They could not stand the smell. The stench was so strong that it could be smelled even in the gardens of Versailles. Visitors could smell the stench from hundreds of meters away. The world's reaction was mixed, ranging from horror to morbid curiosity. Royal court sent their doctors not to help, but to personally observe this unique case. Doctors from all over Europe came to witness one of the greatest monarchs in history literally decomposing. Letters, reports, and denunciations flew across the continent, describing in detail how absolute power was dying before their eyes. By September, gangrene had reached the shin, then the knee. Every day, pieces of black flesh fell off during dressing changes. His leg looked like it had been taken from a battlefield. Bare bone, rotting tissue, oozing infection, which no remedy of the time could cure. September 1st, 1715, was the day of his death. By 7 in the morning, Louis could hardly speak. Gangrene had set in on the muscles of his throat. He called his great-grandson to him and whispered hoarsely, "Don't follow in my footsteps. I loved war too much." These were some of the last words that could be understood. Soon even whispering became impossible. Saint-Simon, one of the court physicians, recorded the king's last hours in detail. At 11 p.m. on August 31st, Louis was in the final stages of systemic gangrene. His organs were failing one after another. At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, the Sun King's heart stopped. But even after his death, the nightmare did not end. His body began to decompose rapidly. The infection that was eating away at him from the inside did not stop with the heart. Within a few hours, the corpse began to swell from the gases released by bacteria. Dr. Versalles, the court pathologist, performed an autopsy just 6 hours after death, while the body was still suitable for examination. His report, classified for 200 years and only found in 1891, revealed the full extent of the disaster. The entire left side of the body, from the feet to the head, was covered in gangrene. The skin had peeled away. The muscles of the throat had turned black and decomposed. The intestines were twice as long as normal and contained a strange, large formation that was not found in medical descriptions of the time. The embalmer faced an impossible task. Louis XIII's body was decomposing too quickly for conventional embalming methods to be used. The people working on the body were forced to wear thick cloth masks soaked in perfume, but even that did not help. Some of them vomited and ran out of the room. The procedures, which usually took several days, had to be completed in a hurry in a matter of hours. The funeral turned into a grim farce. The coffin had to be hastily sealed and reinforced with lead plates because the body continued to swell from the accumulated gases. During the farewell ceremony, strange sounds came from inside the coffin. Clicks, gurgling, hissing. It was as if the king's body was disintegrating even after death. The final cover-up proved no less complicated than his entire life. Official reports stated that the king had died peacefully after a brief illness, but 3 weeks of continuous agony, during which his body decomposed while he remained conscious, were too horrific to be publicly acknowledged. Within 48 hours of his death, a campaign to destroy the evidence began. Dr. Fagan's medical records were burned. Felix's surgical diary disappeared for 3 centuries. The autopsy report was hidden in classified archives and only made public in 1891. Documents about the delivery of huge quantities of perfume used to mask the stench disappeared without a trace. The man who called himself the Sun, who proclaimed his power a gift from above, who built Versailles as a monument to royal grandeur, died a foul-smelling, rotting mass of infected flesh. It all came to the height of irony. A monarch who considered himself a demigod died in conditions worse than those of the poorest peasant. His mind remained conscious until the very end, imprisoned in a body that was devouring itself. Thus ended the story of Louis, a man once called the most handsome ruler in the Christian world. His body decayed in agony, which even his own doctors refused to treat. He built Versailles as a symbol of his eternal glory, but died in a stench that repulsed everyone around him. Modern doctors are certain that all this could have been prevented. Simple hygiene, regular washing, timely surgery, and he could have lived longer. Anal fistula and gangrene are not a death sentence, but the pride of absolute monarchy, blind faith in his own invulnerability, and unwillingness to trust medicine all doomed him to a humiliating and painful death. There is a cruel truth in this. A man who claimed to have been appointed by God himself and demanded unconditional obedience ended up a walking corpse that everyone shunned. His divine right proved powerless in the face of the reality of human flesh and death. The legacy of the Sun King is not only the grandeur of Versailles and the splendor of the court. It is also a reminder that even the most absolute power cannot defeat the inevitable. Death does not recognize titles.